Today I'm reading the Atoll lore about the Fifth Sphere expansion from The Greater Good. The Fifth Sphere expansion. When a returning recon probe proved that some of the Fourth Sphere Tau still lived, the Fifth Sphere expansion was founded to reunite the survivors with the Empire. Beyond the Startide Nexus, they met with strange findings and foul foes. Barely a quarter of the Fourth Sphere fleet had escaped the hellish sub-realm they had been pitched into by the mass failure of their ship's AL-38 slipstream modules. Countless colonists were slain by murderous and sadistic creatures dwelling there that defied all Tau understanding of the universe. Given the horror they had endured, most of the survivors could barely speak of how they escaped. It surprised many of the Fifth Sphere Tau that what discomforted their lost kin more than anything else was the presence of non-Tau species in the Fifth Sphere fleet. The Fourth Sphere's own auxiliaries could not be found, with only dark theories circulating as to why. Despite the many questions that still hung ominously in the air, Shadowsun wasted little time in progressing the Fifth Sphere expansion. The Nem'yar Atoll was wild and contested by myriad races. Piratical orc fleets terrorized the Fulnar Nebula in the east, and scattered Tyranid tendrils roamed hungrily. Several Imperial worlds were swept up quickly by Shadowsun's forces, having been left vulnerable and isolated by the Devourer of Hope, known to humans as the Great Rift. The Fourth Sphere Tau relished war against these humans, carrying out acts of incredible barbarity such as the slaughter at Salkyo, the Fioliol Station bloodshed, and many others that haunted Shadowsun and the Ethereal High Council. Such were these atrocities that many commanders of the Fourth Sphere were subjected to the ritual punishment of Maukla. Despite these hindrances, a multitude of colonies were established. Only months after the miraculous reunification with the Fourth Sphere survivors, the Nem'yar Atoll came under attack. Without warning, an immense armada of ships resembling hideously changed Imperial vessels broke into real space before the Startide Nexus itself, disgorging torrents of ordnance and boarding torpedoes. The Nexus's defense platforms were buffeted by shot that corroded their crisp armoured hulls in the blink of an eye. Boarded defenders found themselves under attack from enemies that resembled space marines, but with bodies grotesquely degenerated and beset by foul plagues. Many wielded huge scythes that could cut a crisis battlesuit in twain, or carried weapons that spewed gouts of toxic slime. Despite their hideous deformities, they were terrifyingly resilient, shrugging off withering weapons fire with impunity. For all the surprise of the attack, the Tau forces were highly disciplined, and the defence fleets responded with laudable speed. A great many of the invading ships were destroyed in salvos of heavy fire, but they were remarkably durable, like the hulking abominations that crewed them, and large numbers more survived. They disgorged thousands of warriors from their heaving bulks who descended upon stellar fortifications and ships with incredible ferocity, spreading their filth with joyous abandon. Broken reports spoke of the Tau themselves being infected by the invaders' disgusting contagions. None could explain how the Tau could be affected by Guela diseases, and yet they were. Some orbital stations were so ravaged that their captains' last acts before succumbing to illness were to set their stations to self-destruct, lest what they suffered spread to others. When Shadowsun learned of the assault, she responded without hesitation. Correlating data from battles on Kellic and Calendula, Shadowsun identified the attackers as the Death Guard. The Nexus could not fall to these monsters. The Death Guard could not be allowed to enter it and attack the main Tau Empire. Upon arrival at the Nexus, Shadowsun's fleet broke down into small battle groups, each with dedicated targets and responsibilities. Some relieved beleaguered defence stations, while others engaged the Death Guard fleet head-on. Every action was part of detailed, overlapping plans to present so many targets to the Death Guard that their fleet would fracture. Battle groups taunted and baited, retreating then striking again. So this continued, but the casualties mounted at an enormous rate. Though the number of putrid Death Guard wrecks began to grow, it was not enough to stop them. Scores of vessels still made to enter the Nexus. In a rare moment of doubt, Shadowsun considered that it might not be possible to win and ordered for the Empire to be warned. In a blaze of light, an advanced prototype messenger drone sped from Shadowsun's command ship, past the Death Guard fleet and into the Startide Nexus. As some of the Death Guard ships burrowed into the Nexus, those left behind suddenly withdrew from battle, their pestilential hulls absorbing terrific punishment as they made for a warp jump point. Vengeful Tau destroyed some, but a great many escaped, peeling away from the fields of fetid wrecks like a bandage drawn back from a still seeping wound. On the other side of the Nexus, in the zone of silence, the Startide defence fleets waited with bated breath. Reinforcements had been pulled in from across the Empire following the warning carried by the drone. But nothing happened. No foul plague ship emerged from the Nexus. For months, the Tau operated at the highest level of readiness, but there was nothing. The waiting was almost worse than battle, such was the tension. At any point, horrific forces could appear and submerge the zone of silence in a deluge of virulence. To what end the Death Guard's destructive attack had been launched, theories abounded. Tau strategists had no way of knowing whether this end had ever been achieved, but all agreed the threat persisted. The Nexus's permanent defences were increased and battlefield data was scrutinised for answers. The Chaunath Expanse. The Chaunath Expanse, home to the Nem'yar Atoll, was riven by conflict. Tau fleets discovered Imperial worlds in the grip of civil war and mass civilian uprisings. Bringing the systems to this region into the greater good would require immense resolve and discipline. Shadowsun was confident that her warriors were capable. The humans of the Chaunath Expanse had been beset by disaster after disaster. Firstly, the emergence of the Great Rift, accompanied by Tau overtures and invasions, and secondly, the Genestealer cult uprisings. Instances of mutation and seditious witchery increased, and governors and ruling councils bickered over which of these blights were causes and which were symptoms as they fought to retain control. Not one system avoided conflict. Shadowsun herself attacked Asturias in the Thexaral system. Though the Stephius and Eregian systems were not directly assaulted by Tau forces, they were subject to Genestealer cult uprisings, so successful that more than half of their key worlds fell in a matter of months. Those few that remained loyal held on by a thread, their enduring faith in the Emperor all that gave them strength. The defenders of Haphos were embroiled in the intense guerrilla war with Xenos cultists, complicated by murderous Tau infiltrators and their duplicitous diplomats. The Ryotov system became an inferno of bloodshed between the Tau, Astra Militarum, and Genestealer cultists. The inhabitants of Verothian in the Baralier system counted themselves fortunate for some time, before cursing their luck when the first forays of Tau encroachment triggered a mass uprising from long-forgotten parts of the Underhive in their capital. The Tau's core strategy remained the same as with any sphere of expansion. Disenfranchised human populations were wooed with tales of the wonders of the greater good. Insurrectionist cells were cultivated and ambitious leaders supported. Still, the Tau never expected to contend with the Genestealer cults. When battlefield data was accumulated and autopsies were carried out on the corpses of strangely mutated humans, the horrible truth was revealed. They discovered monstrous hybrids of human and tyrannid genetic strands. Debate raged amongst the Earth caste as to how this was possible, but all agreed that these creatures had to be destroyed with extreme prejudice. The Tau were quick to take advantage of the pandemonium of the wars already raging between Imperial forces and the Genestealer cults, but it was not just the presence of human tyrannid hybrids that surprised them. Guevesa auxiliaries talked of miracles that often occurred around the Imperium's priest caste, defying any scientific understanding. The reports told of strange anomalies of human behaviour, sometimes outbursts of violent insanity even occurred amongst the Guevesa themselves. Meanwhile, strange portents were seen by the Chaunath Expanse's Genestealer cults. Many expected the arrival of the Star Children to be heralded by a great veil of shadow and silence, according to their scriptures and founding legends. When their leaders observed an increase in human psychic potential on their worlds and a rising number of their own Maguses being born, they were concerned. For many, these omens meant one thing. The Star Children deemed them unworthy, and they would have to fight all the harder for their deity's attention and blessing. With the Imperials clinging harder to their own oppressive faith, and the Tau invaders' false creed of the greater good capturing the minds of countless humans, many gene-stealer cults rose up in the name of the Star Children they so revered and worshipped. They would assert the strength of their deities and, in doing so, prove their own worthiness. Some even saw the increased number of Maguses as a positive sign, a weapon given to them by the Star Children to destroy their enemies. In the eyes of the Imperium, the Xenos threatened the very souls of the people. The great cathedral of the Ministorum sent out their priests far and wide, believing that only unshakable faith could see mankind through this most severe of tests. The knowledge that the Emperor protects reassured all, from the lowliest factory menial to the greatest planetary lord. The Emperor had seen them safe for thousands of years through great trials and turbulent times, and he would see them safe through this too. Also the gilded Vauxhalls on every Hablock, Manufactorum and Basilica blared. The raising of Asturias. The imperial cardinal world of Asturias was celebrated across the sector for its magnificent architecture, incredible wealth and priceless relics. When the planet's unshakable devotion to the Emperor saw its leaders reject the Tau overtures without hesitation, Commander Shadowsun herself led the resulting assault. The severed heads of the Tau delegation were sent to meet Asturias' leadership, presented to Shadowsun in 5 large, gilded chests lined with plush red velvet, one for each caste. The humans had shown that they knew the difference between the castes, that they had listened to the Tau delegates and murderously rejected them all the same. The death of the ethereal, in particular, made Shadowsun's blood boil. She resolved that an example must be made of these Gweila. Such an act would surely bring others into the fold of the Tau Va more peaceably. Shadowsun took solace in the fact that countless more diplomatic efforts were being made all over Keshval, the Tau's name for Asturias. Hundreds of watercast agents met in secret with middle-ranking laymen across the planet. They learned that the united front presented by Asturias' governing body was in fact a thin veneer that concealed the world's highly fractious politics. Every family had aspirations, fears, rivals, and enemies, all exploitable by the Tau. In some places, the Tau formed agreements, promising positions of influence after the planet's fall in exchange for alliance. In others, Tau troops trained in clandestine warfare launched raids against specific targets, their goal to make their attacks resemble those of rival factions. Insurrectionists were encouraged and armed. Intelligence was gathered, constantly feeding data into Shadowsun's growing picture of the future battlescape. Some reports were more disturbing and unexpected. Deep in crypts, tunnels, and other hidden areas, Tau reconnaissance elements found strange graffiti depicting worms or serpents. Some even recorded sightings of multi-limbed creatures scurrying away into the darkness. At this stage, none could say with certainty what these beings were, though the Tau were aware that weaknesses in human genetics sometimes led to ugly mutations and freak births. In keeping with her mastery of Kalyon, the art of the patient hunter, Shadowsun did not launch her assault on Asturias for months. She knew that the more undermined and fractured the planet's leadership was, the swifter her campaign would be overall. By the time Tau dropships launched in their thousands, Asturias was on the brink of civil war. Such were Shadowsun's preparations that not even alien conquest would threaten enough to bring Asturias' conflicting factions together. Nonetheless, those intending to resist readied themselves. All over Asturias, the vast cathedral cities that made up the bulk of its inhabited areas revealed their capabilities. Gilded domes opened like blossoming flowers to reveal banks of anti-air cannons. Panes of stained glass windows, hundreds of meters long, slid into their frames to unveil huge hangar bays filled with swift fighter craft. Processions of robe-clad monks took to the streets and barracks, whipping up crowds of people and ranks of soldiers into frenzies of hatred for the alien. The Tau made no direct assaults against those formidable defences, seeing such a strategy as a waste of lives and resources. Instead, their warriors were deployed in those urban districts deemed friendly following the watercast campaigns, or in the vast open spaces that were maintained as pleasure gardens, game parks, or simply left wild. Nevertheless, the Tau contingents moved into battle swiftly, determined to bring the fighting for Keshval to a swift conclusion. Armoured interdiction cadres duelled Astra Militarum armoured companies in the Sagittarian fields, hammerheads picking off Leman Russ battle tanks with their devastating railguns. The urban sprawl of Bellinok was stalked by roving tribes of Kroot working in tandem with breacher cadres, their task to root out hunkered-down human infantry that had created a veritable fortress of razor wire, weapon pits, and bunkers. Kroot carnivores used their keen hunting senses to discover well-concealed Gwelar soldiers, while breacher teams employed their advanced close-quarters training to destroy human positions with their pulse blasters. Battle played out across the world as the Tau kept up a constant stream of hit-and-run attacks. Shadowsun desired to demonstrate the Tau's military superiority by defeating as many of the fanatical enemy as possible, to force surrender without giving the Imperium anything like a solid victory of its own. But that surrender never came. Human resistance was dogged, their belief in their Emperor especially strong. Shadowsun was particularly troubled by accounts of miracles, as the Grey Vaser and human prisoners described them. Some told of blinding light that obscured the charges of hundreds of human troops before they smashed into fire warrior lines. Others were barely credible tales of priest types flying through the air with vicious chain blades to carve through battlesuits in mid-flight. Whatever the reports, none conformed to the physical laws as the Tau understood them, yet drone-recorded battle footage showed such events occurring. So pervasive were some of these events that elements of the Grey Vaser turned on their Tau allies, screaming their repentance as they opened fire on those they had called comrades only minutes before. Frequent breakouts of insanity occurred in the Tau ranks, of the same kind the Tau had encountered after the Devourer of Hope emerged. As before, these were confined to humans and other non-Tau species and were swiftly concealed by the Tau hierarchy. Any Tau discovered referring to strange aliens stepping out of the ruined corpses of insane humans were quarantined and dispatched to special hospitals for recovery. When a detachment of 4th Sphere Tau were discovered by their 5th Sphere allies, killing prisoners, including humans who had already embraced the greater good, its commander stated that one day the rest of the Empire would thank him before he took the Mapgla. As the fighting raged on all over Asturias, Shadowsun looked keenly for a crucial weakness that she could capitalize on to bring the bloody war to an end. The humans' morale was strong, stronger than she had ever seen before. They held to their beliefs with a vigour that almost defied imagination. Their faith was their life, it was their greatest strength. Could that make it their greatest weakness? Gathered intelligence indicated that the humans fought hard over sites and artifacts of particular religious significance, and that if these fell or were captured, acts of individual surrender spiked. When human propaganda boasted that not a single cathedral city had fallen, Shadowsun knew her next move. She would topple the planet's greatest cathedral city, Iglisor Magna. The capture of such a place would surely cripple the resolve of the staunchest human defenders. They would know their Emperor was not with them when the broadcast filled with Tau declarations of victory and peace offerings to those humans that still resisted began in earnest. Shadowsun's forces made to surround Iglisor Magna. Potential human relief forces were subject to relentless assault as Riptide and Ghostkill battlesuits ambushed armoured columns, and innumerable swarms of drones were deployed to harass infantry forces. Tau contingents surrounding the cathedral city were under strict orders from Shadowsun to leave clear a passage outwards. She could not risk the defenders believing that they had no option but a fight to the death. Escape had to be seen as a real possibility for them, although Shadowsun's forces were secretly placed to kill or capture any that actually attempted to break out. The Tau intercepted and hacked all human communications and broadcast demands to surrender. Those that handed themselves over, they declared, would be offered food, water, and safety. Not one Gwela capitulated. Advanced infiltration cadres made the first forays into Iglisor Magna, striking from all directions. They expected fierce resistance from the outset, their only mission to identify defensive emplacements and mark them out for destruction. However, they were actually able to advance several kilometers into the city past abandoned defensive cannons and bunkers. They did not know why the Gwela had yielded these positions, and Shadowsun cautiously ordered her follow-up contingents to begin securing them so that they could not be reoccupied by the humans. Hundreds of fire warrior teams tactically advanced from gilded column to gilded column, through small chapels, accommodation for menials, and enormous basilicas large enough to house dozens of armoured vehicles. Shadowsun believed that the absence of defenders could only mean a trap, so the advanced cadres were ordered to take deliberate care. In spite of herself, Shadowsun looked forward to the humans' effort to attack her well-trained warriors and to seeing them fail. But she underestimated her opposition. Hundreds of unsuspecting fire warriors were killed when parts of ceiling frescoes were peeled away to reveal murder holes through which the defenders dropped explosives and grenades. Trapdoors large enough to swallow storm surges opened beneath the advancing Tau force. Those unfortunate enough to fall through were butchered by zealots or destroyed by the autocannons and lascannons of waiting heavy weapons teams. So began months of guerrilla war and counterinsurgency actions. Cao Yon and Montclair strategies were carried out at squad level. The humans knew every secret passage of their cathedral city, using them to their immense advantage, and in so doing claiming countless Tau lives. The Tau drew the defenders into ambushes in kill zones of their own, utilising the secret passageway network themselves where they discovered it, or deliberately threatening certain artefacts or shrines to draw out Iglisor Magna's rogue defenders. As casualties mounted, Shadowsun refused to overcommit her forces in all-out assault. To do so would be to throw away lives, and as the noose of Tau forces tightened around the defenders, surrender seemed inevitable. But no surrender came. Shadowsun also had to withdraw her Grey Vaser forces, whose brutality towards the defenders had grown to heights she could not tolerate. Torture of prisoners and mutilation of the dead were common. Some Grey Vaser openly wore jewellery made from the extracted teeth of dead Asturians. They frequently disobeyed orders to hold position, instead pursuing retreating foes, making themselves and others vulnerable in the process. Strange anomalies and insanity outbreaks became more frequent where humans fought other humans. Despite all this, the Tau were winning. More territory was secured with each passing day as the defenders' numbers depleted and their supplies ran low. The desperation of Shadowsun's enemies was finally revealed when thousands of them launched an overwhelming attack to break out. They were nearly successful, such was the surprise they achieved. Thundering companies of battle tanks and tens of thousands of zealous troops came perilously close to overrunning the city's western districts. It was only thanks to Tau discipline and the careful deployment of rapid response cadres full of crisis battlesuits and devilfish mounted fire warrior teams that the attack was stymied. The failure of this assault broke the defenders' backs, such were the resources required to launch it, and finally pockets of emaciated and terrified humans began to surrender. The pace of the Tau's advance soon quickened and the noose tightened completely. Shadowsun herself took to the field in the final battles of the conflict, as the last of Iglisor Magna's starving humans surrendered or were cut down, her twin fusion blasters incinerating countless defenders and melting through scores of bunkers. Shadowsun's victory at Iglisor Magna was projected all over Keshval, the glory of the Tauva shone for all to see. The ethereals of the Fifth Sphere smiled, knowing that surely this spelled the end of human resistance on the planet. Watercast aides prepared victory speeches, but the move was premature. Seeing the mighty spires of Iglisor Magna topple to the ground and shatter into millions of pieces had simply stiffened the resolve of those who still fought. With sadness, Shadowsun had little choice but to accept that much blood was still to be spilled, though humanity's suicidal drive to fight regardless of casualties made her shudder. After the battle's conclusion, Commander Shadowsun walked the walls of Hospital Ship 227. So many of these vessels had been constructed since the Damocles Crusade that the Tau had ceased naming them. Shadowsun had come unannounced, dressed in simple robes. Bunk after bunk was filled with wounded and dying Tau. Many had lost limbs, while others were held down with tight restraints driven mad by horror. Earth-caste orderlies rushed past bearing medicines and surgical equipment, so busy that they failed to notice that Shadowsun herself walked amongst them. Each hospital ship had capacity for around 5,000 wounded. Every one of the dozens in Asturias' orbit were operating well beyond those limits. Shadowsun saw the dead jettisoned from airlocks in their hundreds. They would normally have been burned in honourable funeral ceremonies, but such were their numbers and the demand for space that there was simply no time to observe tradition. The commander knew that not one of the fallen would begrudge this necessity. None of it mattered so long as it was done for the greater good. Battle still raged on Asturias, and Shadowsun would not let their sacrifice be in vain. And that's all the lore we get from the Tau perspective in the Greater Good Psychic Awakening book. Next up is going to be the Imperial perspective.